I'm here with Dr. Kenneth W. Kemp, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me.
Well, I'm glad to do it.
And today we're going to be talking a little bit about faith and science and reason and some topics in philosophy and evolution. So, Dr. Kemp, could you start by just telling us a little bit about your training and your background and what you've done with your career?
Well, I began studying in philosophy and the history of science in about 1979. I got a PhD from Notre Dame in philosophy in 1984. I've taught for 35 years, the last 30 here at St. Thomas, and then I retired from teaching. I've been retired for 5 years, but I'm continuing to do research. So it's kind of like being on sabbatical, but without a paycheck.
So you're still doing some research right now, and
Yes.
is it in the area of evolution related topics?
Mostly so.
Okay.
So I did get an invitation from a local parish to do some lectures on Polish culture, which is a kind of avocational interest. So I'm taking a little break
okay.
from evolution to read about poetry and history and saints.
Oh, that's
But,
fascinating. And
it's,
is this sort of related to your background in linguistics in the sort of Eastern European languages? And
It is. I have a master's in Slavic linguistics that focused on Russian, but I did a little bit of other languages as well. When the Iron Curtain fell, I thought it would be a good project to try to reestablish connections, help build Catholic intellectual culture in Russia. And Russia was always hard to travel to. And I made better connections in Ukraine, so I did a lot of work there. When I was, I taught short courses in Kiev. When I did that, Kiev was still a bilingual city. People didn't really care whether you spoke Russian or Ukrainian. Even in a conversation, they didn't care. If you started the conversation in Russian and they wanted to answer in Ukrainian, they would, or vice versa. So anyway, I did that, and also made some connections in Poland, which didn't really need reconstruction of Catholic intellectual life. They had managed to keep it alive through the communist period, but still I thought it would be an interesting place to take students to expose them to Polish culture, and so we did some courses there.
so were these pilgrimages, or were they courses for a semester?
No,
How
they
long
were
did last?
academic courses.
Okay.
We started out with one on Catholicism and Orthodoxy in Ukraine. Then we did one on comparative politics of the new Europe, as some people call it. We went to Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, and looked at how each one had responded to the opportunities that arose with the collapse of communism into the Soviet Union. And then we did one on John Paul in his Polish context. And so there was always an academic course, a month-long academic course. The teaching of it was done by their faculty, and we did the grading and the overall plan. So they got a chance to hear from local scholars about their own culture rather than just us take them over and talk to them ourselves. So anyway, that's what we did, and that's what I'm working on now. Not that I've lost interest in this, but a priest asked me to do it, and so I thought, sure, I'll do it.
Oh, a priest asked you to do what you're doing now?
No,
Or
the
previous
lectures,
one?
the lectures at,
Okay.
at the parish. I mean, the priest invited me to come give lectures at his parish on Polish culture.
Oh,
And
okay.
so that's what did that. I still have I've got a work in press now, a book that, and I just, so.
What's the book that's in press right now?
It's called Origins of Catholic Evolutionism. So
Okay.
I suppose at the end of my introduction to myself, I should have said I did 2 books in addition to various articles. One is The War That Never Was, and then the other one is Origins of Catholic Evolutionism, 1831 to 1950. And I'm waiting for the copy editors to write me back and say, I hope, what a marvelous book. Everything in order, no queries here. But
Right.
of course that won't happen. We'll have, whatever cleaning
The usual
up.
back and forth.
Yes, yes. So
Okay. Well, I'm really excited about that because I got this book, The War That Never Was, and I know in the introduction there's a footnote mentioning your forthcoming next book, and I'm already excited about that one as well. And is
Okay.
that the one that is mentioned here is the Catholic Evolutionism? Is this
It,
where
it
you're
must
going
must
to?
be that because I was
Okay.
already underway in that. I mean, I've got some other ideas, but I've probably got like everybody more ideas than I have time. So, but I think that
Yeah.
must be the one that I mentioned there because it was the next one that I was
Okay.
working on. So,
So I want to talk about the new book,
okay,
the next book, but let's talk about this one first. So I
okay,
got the book in my hand is my copy of uh, The War That Never Was, Evolution and Christian Theology. And this is a fascinating book about sort of, it's a little more historical in giving an overview of this sort of conflict, uh, the conflict thesis, I guess, or the conflict
yeah.
model
Theory
that some
model.
people
Different
have
people
been.
use different
Yeah,
words.
the idea is that some people have been under the impression that there is an intrinsic, long-standing conflict between Christianity and evolution. And is that the correct way to think about this? So tell us about your book and your work
Yeah.
on this.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. I began with the recognition that there's a popular acceptance of the idea that the relation is either inherently or at least factually a matter of warfare between one or the other. I want to emphasize the term popular acceptance because it's surely not uh, a view that's respected by scholars or historians. There's been a number of different books responding to that in various ways. That is, arguing that this conflict thesis or warfare thesis puts the history out of focus. And so, what I wanted to do was make a contribution to that literature. And so that's what the book is. The thesis itself, as we just said, has, I think this puts it in slightly different words from what we said before, but it's got a philosophical version and an historical version. That is, somebody might say there's a kind of intrinsic tension underlying the conflict that and that would be the philosophical thesis. Or somebody might say, well, whether there's some intrinsic conflict or not, there's in fact been a conflict, and a salient feature of the history of the intellectual history of our culture is this conflict. So I tried to respond to each. In the first chapter, I tried to respond to the philosophical version, the idea that science is inherently skeptical, demanding of empirical evidence, critical, and so on, and that theology or religion, by contrast, is based on revelation. It's uncritical in its acceptance of traditional views, and sometimes, well, that's one kind of philosophical conflict. I suppose one might say here's another, that science emphasizes natural processes and theology emphasizes something supernatural. And so, one way or another, various people have tried to put together the idea that there's an intrinsic conflict. I suppose one could have written a whole book about that. Other people have. But I just did one chapter responding to that idea that there's an intrinsic conflict. Then I went on to the historical conflict, which was the main thing that I wanted to do in the book. As I say, it's especially after the first chapter, much more historical than philosophical.
Yeah.
What?
Can I ask one more question
yeah.
before we get into
Yeah.
the history part? Because I think that introduction. There's some really interesting insights there that I want to flesh out a little bit more. So you're saying that theology or religion, maybe we'll say, and science have intrinsically different methods, and this is maybe one source of the perceived conflict. Is that science, by its nature, is skeptical and demanding of evidence, and is always seeking the novelty, right? You're trying to identify the new in science by its nature, whereas religion, in contrast, by its nature, is much more conservative in the sense that it's a reception of handed down, preserved, right? So they're different for sure, but the difference doesn't necessarily mean opposed to one another.
That's right, because their subject matter is different, not as completely as Stephen Jay Gould says in his famous essay on non-overlapping magisteria. I think he goes too far on that. But yeah, there is a difference, but there's a reason for that difference, and the difference is sometimes exaggerated, but need not be so. I mean, the idea that the scientist is skeptical, yes, in a certain way that's true, and eager to overthrow the reigning paradigm. And someone asked me, well, how often do you dream of overthrowing the theory of evolution? I mean, you don't. I mean, of course, if problems emerge with it, conceivably you could have to give it up, but it's not easy, I think, for a biologist to say, yeah, I can conceive of doing that, because it's so well established. The task of the ordinary biologist, the extraordinary biologist, you might say too, is to show how things that don't seem to fit into the theory, in fact, fit after all. And if you can't do it and can't do it and can't do it, and he's really bold, then he challenges the theory. If he's not really bold, I guess I'm not as good as biologist as I thought I was. Maybe I'm be good at hardware sales or something like that. So I mean, it's one doesn't want to minimize that skeptical feature of scientific work, but one doesn't want to exaggerate it either. And similarly in theology, there are things that are settled and things that are not, and so there are controversies. How exactly should we understand the idea that our Lord atoned for our sins? How did he atone for my sins? What exactly is this word atonement or redeem? Redeem? Bought back? Bought back from whom? There are going to be different ideas of how we should understand that, even though the general idea that he redeemed us by atoning for our sins, or that he's God, isn't really open to question. If it's even less open to question than the fundamental principles of the theory of evolution, it's because the source is more certain and more reliable. So, I mean, the one has revelation from God, the other is a product of determined investigation by people who are really interested in getting the answer. They could be wrong, but they're probably not.
Yeah, and so within both the scientific tradition and the religious traditions, there are conflicts. We're not saying there's never conflicts, but it might not be religion versus science. Instead, one thing that you've identified in your book has been that this conflict might be a conflict between new ideas and old ideas.
Yeah.
Maybe this will lead into our discussion about the
I mean, there
history.
are conflicts within science as well. Within any particular science, of course, but especially also, if not even more, between different sciences, not constantly, but sometimes. Think of the end of the 19th century when the biologists and the geologists, needing a really old Earth, said the Earth must be really old. Otherwise, the Rocky Mountains wouldn't have had time to rise as far as they did, or things like that. The certain physicists calculating the rate of cooling of the Earth said the Earth can't possibly be that old, because if it were that old, it would be much cooler than it is. Each side had serious scientific reasons for defending their view, but they differed from one another. Now, in fact, in this case, the geologists and biologists turned out to be right. What the geologists did not know about in the end of the 19th century was radioactivity, and the way radioactive elements, as they decayed inside the Earth, would heat things up in a way that offset the cooling that they had otherwise expected. So you got a difference between some scientists and other scientists. Was a conflict? Yes. Each side said the other was wrong and give reasons and stuff like that. But it's not. It doesn't show that one side or the other was disreputable or something like that. And so similarly, there can be conflicts between theology and science. And Stephen Jay Gould says, no, they can't be, because theology is about values and science is about facts. But that can't be just so. Because, well, I mean, the theological claims of Christianity, and I mean, we've got to be careful, I suppose, if we try to be too general about religion. Then we'll get involved in disputes about whether is Buddhism a religion or is it a philosophy and stuff like that. So better to focus on one particular religion and its teachings. Christian religion teaches or makes certain factual claims about Jesus, for example. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, then vain is my teaching and vain is your faith, said St. Paul. Well, he rose. In my heart, I feel like he rose. Well, that's not what, I mean, maybe there's something there, but it's not Christianity. I mean, that is, maybe there's some value to you in that feelings, but it's not Christian doctrine. Christian doctrine, he really rose from the dead. It's captured nicely in that line of joke that Easter's canceled, they found the body. I mean, the point of the joke is it's a real historical claim. Now, that's historical claim, not directly scientific claim, in the sense that scientists don't make claims about the particular, though, of course, it's in tension with what a physician might expect.
But this breaks
basis of
down
the science he knows, pardon?
Yeah, what this breaks down Gould's distinction between the facts and values.
Yes.
When,
Yes,
for
it
Christian
does.
theology, there are certain facts. This is
Yes.
not simply a value that we hold.
Yes, Gould is an interesting character. He has a lot of interesting things to say. This has been very popular among some people.
Yeah.
Well, people that are trying to make peace, which Gould was trying to do. So, I mean, we should appreciate the effort, say thank you very much, but we can't agree.
Yeah, so maybe he got the part about the non-overlapping magisteria right, but what is under each magisteria might need to be nuanced a little more, a little differently.
But then you begin to lose the idea that there's no overlap. Because his idea of overlap was one covers one topic and the other covers the other, and so they can't conflict because they don't ever say things about the same topic. And so, but if Christianity says that Jesus rose from the dead, and science says bodies don't rise from the dead, then there's a conflict. So to get back to, I mean, the other aspect of the thing, you said there's not a conflict then between exactly science and theology or religion. but there are conflicts. But well, you mentioned one between old ideas and new ideas. New ideas, especially startling new ideas, of course, meet resistance. One might say about science, that's the way science ought to work. Somebody comes up with a new idea, you don't have every science people say, oh, yes, yes, that's okay, we're for that. There are going to be people that are skeptical about, oh, that's the word for the science, right? They're skeptical about the new idea, and so there's going to be a kind of a battle between the enthusiasts for the new idea and those that thought the old idea worked very well. That's a natural part of science. I'll mention one other conflict that, I mean, there really was a war, you might say, well, metaphorically, but was a war that's between Christians and anti-Christians. I use the word anti-Christian because I mean, maybe you say, why not say atheists or something like, well, not all of them are atheists, some of them are agnostics. Not all atheists are out there, determined to fight against Christianity. Some just go lead their atheistic lives as best they can and without being evangelical about it,
Yeah.
can we say?
Or aggressively, combative.
Aggressive, yeah. So others, as you can see by looking at our culture, are aggressively anti-Christian, and that's not new. It's been, this has been a couple hundred years of fights between Christians and anti-Christians. A couple hundred years, you might say, didn't you ever hear of Julian the Apostate? Well, so I mean, it waxes and wanes, but it's been a theme. So there are these two fights that have been mistaken for fights between science and religion. Why? Because the antis try to drag in help from elsewhere. So the anti-evolutionists, some would were, especially at the beginning, skeptical for ordinary scientific reasons. You mean one species could produce offspring of another species? I don't see that in my barnyard, in my neck of the woods. But some of the anti-evolutionists appealed for religious support for the anti-evolutionary ideas, thus making it appear that it was a war not between evolutionists and anti-evolutionists, but between evolutionists and Christians. Similarly, in the other fight, the fight between Christians and anti-Christians, the anti-Christians put on their lab coats and claimed this is just a consequence of our scientific work. We see that, Christianity must be false. And you see that most clearly in the question of evolution. Well, you see it clearly, they say, also in claims about miracles and so on. We scientists can show that this isn't true. The anti-Christians claimed. The we scientists part was problematic, the same as the anti-evolutionist appeal to revelation was problematic. And in both of those cases, you get people who don't look at the material really closely, thinking that it's a war between science and religion, when it's really one of those other two wars instead.
So in reality, instead of having, the two parties being the Christian and the scientist who are against each other, what you really have is one person who embraces new ideas and may be someone who has both the science and the faith in that area. And then on the other side, somebody else who has scientific and faith claims against it. So you have two individuals, the new and the old, both using science and faith against the other.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. But and you can illustrate it in the history of science by looking at people involved in the discussion, elaboration of these ideas, and you can find very prominent people who are both scientists, or maybe I say people who are both very prominent scientists and very serious about their Christianity. In the Protestant world, I suppose maybe the salient example is Asa Gray, America's great 19th century botanist who was accepted in general the theory of evolution. Did he agree with Darwin at every single point? No, but scientists don't agree with one another in every single point of a complex theory. They might accept some and reject others, but he was surely an evolutionist. On the Catholic side, Alfred Gaudry was, might say, the founder of evolutionary paleontology, doing lots of paleontological work that supported that particular aspect of Darwin's more general theory. So you can read about the Protestant side in two books particularly. One's David Livingstone's Darwin's Forgotten Defenders, and the other is James R. Moore's The Post-Darwinian Controversies. And the Catholic side, that's, you can watch for my new book.
Okay.
Or is that improper
advertising?
advertising?
I'm excited for it. I really want.
Okay.
I'm hoping.
Okay.
I'm really looking forward to the new book as well. Maybe that's a good chance for us to transition into the next line of thinking, which is, moving away from the historical description of what people have actually said over the centuries. Let's get right into the actual philosophical nuts and bolts. Is evolution in conflict with the Christian faith?
I suppose the popular acceptance of the conflict or warfare thesis invites people to think, yeah, there probably is, but I think that that's an improper shift of the burden of proof. That is, we might first ask, why would you think that there is a conflict here? I mean, even if Gould isn't right in his comprehensively non-overlapping magisteria thesis, there's surely is a difference between the primary interest of scientists and primary interest of theologians. Not that they have to be different people, but I mean, a person working as a scientist is trying to solve certain kinds of problems. A person working on theology is trying to solve other kinds. So we need to ask, well, first we need to get clear on the concept of evolution, and then need to ask, why would anybody think there's a conflict here? And I think we can identify a few salient kinds of objection. So let's begin with the question, what is evolution? What do we mean by that term? Because I think to some people it calls to mind some kind of comprehensive worldview that does everything from molecules to man, amoeba to American, something like that. But I mean, maybe the amoeba Americans doesn't quite capture the whole range. So, well, explain the amoebas too. Somebody might think that's what the theory of evolution ought to do. Or molecules. Where do the molecules come from? Well, now we get the Big Bang theory and so on. But they imagine this great, by evolution they mean this great, huge story of things. And I think that's not the right way to understand the term. The evolution is first a particular kind of explanation. So not even yet a theory, I want to say, but a kind of explanation. One that tries to explain something about the world as we see it, typically variety of things, heterogeneity of things, diversity of things, something like that, by appeal to history. And in particular, a history in which you start out with something simpler, something homogeneous, and you explain how natural processes diversified it. Is there a verb to go with heterogeneous? Heterogeneized it.
Yeah,
But
I don't
anyway,
know.
I mean, you start out with something simple. Yeah. So a theory of evolution starts out by what they observe, the diversity, heterogeneity. Uh, the theory posits an earlier, simpler state and processes that diversify the state. That is a pattern of explanation that we can contrast with Newton's theory of celestial motion, for example. That doesn't explain diversity. It explains how things move to the moon, and then cannonballs and cannonballs fired out of cannons. Cannonballs dropped out of leaning towers, if Galileo actually did that. But I mean, it explains motion by appeal to some simple laws and so on. So we could distinguish that fundamentally non-historical kind of theory from evolution. Now, evolution can be recast. Population genetics, for example, can be made to look much more like Newtonian mechanics than what I just said about diversification and so on. But nevertheless, it is, I think, appropriate and helpful to recognize a second kind of explanation to see evolution as at least capable of being cast in that way. That's surely the way Darwin presented it. It's a pattern of explanation because it can be used to explain other things as well. Diversity of languages, for example. The descent with modification. You start out with Latin and you end up with people speaking Portuguese in the Atlantic coast, and by the time you get to the Black Sea, they're all speaking Romanian. So that's, again, a pattern of diversification over time. Other things will be slightly different, but still loosely the same. Diversity of coral reefs, for example. Might say, but it's too obvious, diversity of human beings. Why are some human beings crawling about on the floor and others walking with a cane? Remember the Sphinx? What's four legs in the morning and 2 legs in the day and 3 legs at night? And if you don't answer, you get eaten up. But I mean, that's the answer to that is, well, there's this life cycle. And we start out by crawling and we end up needing a cane. That's too obvious to need any explaining, but the diversity of coral reefs that Darwin noticed in the Pacific Ocean could be explained by a similar pattern of life cycle, we can still say, for corals. Even if the island itself isn't alive, or the reef, is the reef alive? Well, anyway, you get the idea. There's something like a life cycle. It goes, stars too. Why is there diversity? There may be, life cycle is a kind of odd phrase, but the same idea is there. They're diverse because some of them are young and some of them are old. So it's not quite like Darwin's explanation, but it could broadly be called evolutionary.
We're talking about whether or not there is sort of an intrinsic conflict between faith and evolution.
Oh, okay. And in order to do that, we need to say what evolution was.
Yes.
And I said that it should not be seen as some kind of comprehensive philosophical view of the entire world. That evolution is, you might say, first a kind of theory, and then, of course, within it there will be the particular instances, there will be evolutionary theories. And by kind of theory, I mean an approach to explanation, usually explanation of diversity or complexity, by appeal. This is what the theory will contain. An earlier, simpler, or less diversified state, and an account of processes that move or change the state from this earlier, simpler state to the complex state, diversified state that we see around us. So this pattern is, there's a couple things. First, it's applicable to a number of different things: diversity of flora and fauna, diversity of languages. It's not the same theory in the sense that the processes are different, the initial state's different, and so on. The evidence is different. So they don't have to look exactly alike. At a formal state, they look something alike. And so evolutionary biology is one theory that fits that pattern. There are other theories that are loosely like it, but not exactly like it. For example, evolutionary origin of the diversity of stars or of coral reefs, because in each case you have not the kind of diversification that you get in biology and linguistics, but a kind of series of stages where old things are already far along and new things are not. So if stars keep being formed, some of them are old, some of them are new, just like human beings. We say some are still crawling around and others need their king. So anyway, that in general, one wants to think of evolution as a pattern of explanation. It is true that evolutionary biology can be recast in a way that makes it look more like Newton. The way you do that is take the processes out. You're looking at, say, what's happening on this island or in this forest over time, and so you say, all the processes are in operation, but maybe at the beginning of the period you're looking at, there's already complexity. In the end, there's still complexity. It may not be more complex, it may just be different. Well, you might say, well, no, I mean, it could be not new things at all, but a different mix of the traits or something like that. So I mean, you could do that and call it evolution because you're picking up the processes that are part of the historical version of the theory and focusing on those. So that's what evolution is, an evolutionary theory. Darwin's evolutionary theory of evolutionary biology, we've got to be a little bit careful here because sometimes some people, especially critics, somehow imagine that when you say Darwin's theory, I mean every thesis in the Origin of Species taken as, I was going to say gospel truth, but I need another phrase here. I mean, as though the idea is, here's the truth, and if you move away from that, it's not really Darwin's theory anymore. Well, in one sense, I suppose that's true. I mean, Darwin, like every scientist, has some good ideas and some ideas that were maybe promising but didn't in the end work out. So how do you want to use the term Darwin's theory? Most scientists use it to mean the theory inspired by and developed from the origin. Some anti-evolutionists use it to mean every word of the origin taken literally. And see, Darwin's theory has been abandoned because in chapter 6 he says such and so, and nobody believes it anymore. So, but in Darwin's theory, I just mean the theory of evolution along broadly Darwinian lines. And we can see it as explaining the diversity of species that we see in the world around us as the product of an initial state of one or a few first kinds of species that changed over time, that were differentiated over time by natural processes. By which natural processes? Darwin said chiefly but not exclusively natural selection. ever since then, well, not ever since, because Darwin himself, over the 6 editions of the work. Well, first he said, I didn't say exclusively. I said chiefly, and there were disputes over that. There were more enthusiastic selectionists than Darwin, Wallace, for example. There were much less enthusiastic selectionists. Well, maybe they would have said not less enthusiastic selectionists. We're anti-selectionists, people that minimized that, and in a certain way, you might say the history of evolutionary biology since then has been a drift a little bit back and forth as people want to emphasize the value of selection because it seems to work well in their problems, to solve their problems, and people who say it doesn't work so well in mine, so maybe we need another process here, and they've proposed some, and then we can argue about whether drift is really inconsistent with selection, not in any radical sense, because at most you can have a number of processes and some work sometimes and others, or that is in some contexts, and others work in others, and so on. So anyway, but it's convenient to think of Darwin as having these two theses, that is common ancestry of all living species and natural selection, etc., as the processes that do that. So, I needed to take some time at that because when you just say the word evolution, different people understand it different ways. And so I want to focus here on Darwin's ideas as I define them, not word for word, literal reading of the Origin of Species, but that you might say the research program that he launched, and that is still viable today, that seems to be the best explanation of the diversity of species that we see around us. So with that said, we can ask, so why would anybody think that's in tension with, contradictory to anything that Catholic Church teaches? And I'll try to group the objections into four sets of that I think express the kind of general kinds of concerns that people have. The first one is, you might say, conceptual, because it focuses on the concepts of creation and evolution. And said, there's the conflict. Darwin, evolutionary biologists, maybe better just to say that, think that the world is a product of evolutionary processes, but Christianity teaches that the world is a product of an act of creation by God. And so aren't these alternative, inconsistent accounts of where the world came from? And the answer to that is that the idea that there's a conflict here is based on a couple of mistakes. First, it depends. The mistakes are a product of diverse understanding of that vague phrase, where the world came from. What do we mean by where it came from? When the creationist, and I mean that by that somebody who believes in the doctrine of creation, not the narrow sense. I think that too many people have improperly hijacked the word, seized it for their own uses, whereas it belongs to all Christians, because the Christian doctrine, right up to front of the creed, that God created the world. But so the world is a product of divine act of creation. But what that means is the world depends on God for its very existence. Why is there something rather than nothing? That's the paradigmatic question to which creation is an answer. evolution is not an answer to that question. If you want the paradigmatic question for the biologist is, why does the world contain 250,000 different kinds of beetles? That's the question that evolutionary biology is designed to answer, because some beetles will flourish well in one environment and other beetles will flourish well in another environment. And if you had a kind of proto-beetle that wouldn't flourish as well in either environment as the descendants that look like this or the descendants that look like that, the species might eventually split. And before you know it, instead of one species, you have two. And before you know it, you have not two, but 250,000 kinds. So these are not conflicting answers to the same question. They're attempts to answer different questions. The evolutionist presupposes that the world already exists, but doesn't, especially the evolutionary biologist doesn't, but for that matter, the evolutionary cosmologist doesn't ask, and how did it get to be here in the first place? It starts by positing some earlier, simpler state, and the processes that diversify or complexify it or change it over time, but leaves to the theologian, the Christian evolutionary biologist might say, the question of how the world got to be there in the first place, or how it continues in existence, because the Christian doctrine is not the doctrine of a watchmaker. There's two aspects of a watchmaker, I suppose, that we might notice. One is that he designs the world, and the second is this, that once the watchmaker makes his watch and sells it, its continued existence doesn't depend on him. We can buy the watchmaker or buy the watch and then shoot the watchmaker, and the watch will still work. But the world, according to the doctrine of creation, depends on God for its continued existence. Didn't he design it also? Well, yes, in one sense so, but that doesn't mean, or at least Christian doctrine doesn't teach, that he designed every little detail of it, in the sense of putting the wings on the beetle, this color of wings on the beetle. He designed it in the sense of creating a world that had the powers to develop and change over time, the way it in fact did. So there's no tension except in the theory of evolution and the doctrine of creation. That's, I think, one worry. So I think we Christians should say we're all creationists because we believe the world was created by God. The Christian evolutionist can say, I'm a creationist too. You don't get to take the term and use it and say, it's only mine. It only means God shaped the beetles 6,000 years ago and stuff like that. All of us all Christians are creationists. And if you think the evidence for evolution is good, I do, then I suppose you're an evolutionist too. But no silence being told to say, it's a shallower kind of belief. It's fascinating, it's interesting, it's important. The physician might from time to time remind us, but it's it's not at the kind of fundamental level. It's not why is there something rather than nothing, but how does the world that God created work? So I only mean shallower in that sense, not
in the depth of the layers and how they relate to each other.
Yeah.
This is sort of what Theodosius Dobzhansky says too, right? I'm an evolutionist and a creationist, right?
I'm sorry?
This is what Theodosius Dobzhansky also says, right?
Yes.
He says,
yes,
I'm an evolutionist.
Yes, in that famous article that everybody quotes for the line, nothing makes sense except in light of evolution, nothing in biology.
Yes.
Which he does say, which is meaningful, but he also says there, I'm a creationist and an evolutionist, so usually I quote that in this context.
Very important.